Welcome to today's lecture on the core elements. This is lecture 1, part 1. This methodology is germane to all of the academic courses which I teach at various universities and to the House of Night Falcon. This material is copyrighted 2021 by the House of Night Falcon and all rights are reserved. I want to begin this lecture with a discussion of what led me to the development of this core methodology, and then we will look at the starting point, the implications, and how to build a different paradigm. Again, this is germane to ethics in the computer age, contemporary moral problems, world religions, intro to philosophy, philosophy of religion, and it is key to how the House of Night Falcon does its work. So let's start at the beginning, the background. Without a doubt, one of the most powerful experiences of my life was reading the Iliad and the Odyssey when I was 7.5. That was followed when I was 9.5 by reading a somewhat watered down version of Relativity. Together, these became a transformative experience. Having read the watered down form of Relativity, it would lay the foundation for my interest in the sciences. And while that interest would dominate certainly until I was about 16, the longer term influence would be provided by the Iliad and the Odyssey. When I finished the Iliad and the Odyssey, I came away convinced that for Homer there was one and only one question. And whether in science, philosophy, theology, in every discipline that I have worked on throughout the course of my life, this is the core question. How I have addressed that question has varied. Clearly, for example, those younger years of my life were dominated by a kind of Aristotelian view of the world and what would ultimately become called the received view of science. I truly believed that the universe in and of itself was intelligible, and that ultimately, given enough time, enough patience, and obviously enough money, science would be able to render that structure and that order functional, reproducible, and ultimately usable by the human species. This move towards science was also responsible for a kind of reductionism. That is to say, I began to abandon the concept of a special creation in Genesis, or in the Roman Catholicism with which I had been raised, and increasingly began to focus on the idea that humans were nothing more than a carbon life form. I wasn't sure at that point what that meant, nor was I specifically ready to abandon everything that I had been taught. Without a doubt, a key event in the course of my life would happen when I was 16 years old. It was Labor Day, and I had been working at the Bingham Oceanography Laboratory at Yale under Grace Pickford. Grace had paid the ultimate price for her science. Her husband was a Yale professor, and they divorced because science was a priority in her life. Grace had spent her entire life studying an obscure species of fish called Fungulus heterocleides and looking for their growth hormone. Grace, at the time, was 64. This was her last opportunity to complete the experiment successfully. On Labor Day of that year, we were in a windowless room dissecting the most recent batch of fish. And I will never forget the look on Grace's face when she realized that for the last time, after 40 years of research, she would not find what she was looking for. At the same time, something else happened. Something that I think about frequently, particularly as I continue to think about and work on the physics of light. At the same time that I was working with Grace Pickford, I was incredibly fascinated with theoretical physics and chemistry. Let's get this right. I realized that in every scientific formula there was a constant, and that constant was the equivalent to putting a shim up under the short leg of the table. What the constant told me was that we would never know how the universe worked. We would always have an approximate knowledge. A kind of guess. I was unwilling at the time to let go of the idea that the universe was inherently intelligible in and of itself. But this definitely began the collapse of that idea. By the time that I reached the age of 20, I had discovered Wittgenstein's Tractatus and the idea that language is the scaffold we place around the world. The scaffold, the structure, and came to the conclusion that without language, there is no meaning, which led me to the realization that the world is not intelligible. Intelligibility is the function of the human mind and its refusal to let go, its refusal to live in an ambiguous universe. The overarching question then became why? What is it about being human that necessitates that the world be intelligible, that uses language in such a way that we render the world intelligible? In part, the answer to that question would come by looking at the nature of language. And again, at this point in the lecture, we're keeping things at a very high level. We will return to some of these concepts later. I discovered that there was, in fact, a parallel between something Heidegger would say and something Wittgenstein said. I'm in part in debt to Paul Homer for some of this. Wittgenstein draws a distinction between language which says and language which shows. Though he wouldn't put it quite this way, this is the language of emotion and myth and art and music. The meaning is somehow inherent. and the language of art, emotion, and myth isn't somehow fundamentally different than language which talks about the world in logical terms. When I coupled this with Heidegger's notion of poetic dwelling, the last underpinnings of the Aristotelian view of the world with which I had been raised began to fall away. Though I was not completely ready at that point to either internalize Heidegger or Wittgenstein, I had read a number of the works of Erich Fromm when I was in high school, my sophomore year, and I began to search for an option that would allow me to better understand the concept of language that shows versus language that says. And though I wasn't prepared to use the Heideggerian word primordial, I needed to know in very real terms which one came first. And I began to see that the answer to that question would ultimately allow me to come back to Homo and the question of what it means to be human. The key to developing this methodology that I use across all my academic classes, as well as in the art that I create, would ultimately be supplied by Erich Fromm in his book, The Anatomy of Human Destructiveness. This collection of passages which you see here are from page 225 following, and I want to highlight a couple of the points that Fromm makes. Please understand that there are a number of aspects of his argument that I do not necessarily agree with, but the point would seem to be that we are in fact aware. And while he stresses instrumental intelligence and reason, he, I believe, will ultimately lay out the absolute important starting point for everything that I do, how I teach, how I think, how I see the world, and how I create art. And we begin to see that exactly here. Gifted with self-awareness and reason, man is aware of himself as being separate from nature and from others. He's aware of his powerlessness, his ignorance. He is aware of his end, death. He is set apart while being apart. He is homeless, yet chained to the home he shares with all creatures. Cast into this world at an accidental place and time, he is forced out of it accidentally and against his will. And further, I propose that man's nature cannot be defined in terms of a specific quality, such as love, hate, reason, good, or evil, but only in terms of the fundamental contradictions that characterize human existence and have their root in the biological dichotomy between missing instincts and self-awareness. Man's existential conflict produces certain psychic needs common to all men. He is forced to overcome the horror of separateness, of powerlessness, of lostness, and to find new forms of relating himself to the world to enable him feel at home. I have called these psychic needs existential because they are rooted in the very conditions of human existence. Fromm will go on to say that one of the points that's absolutely critical to understand, I would couch in terms that are different to what Fromm himself would say. And by the way, that will come down to the word contradiction. I would prefer that we think about what Fromm is calling contradictions not as mutually exclusive possibilities, but as a perpetual state of being undefined. By his own admission, we don't know who we are. If you think about the implications of this, we are constantly in a state of being in between. On the one hand, we are acutely aware of ourselves as individuals, but we are equally aware of the fact that we exist in relationship. We do not do well existing as isolated islands, but some other relationship, implicitly social, is required for us to get the affirmation we need, as well as the sense of love, being cared for and cared about. So implicit in the argument is that this awareness of being a part of the physical world and being apart from the physical world is found not only in our relationship to the universe, but also in our relationship to other humans. The same indefiniteness, the same ultimate confrontation with insecurity, curiosity, the need for comfort. As Fromm will go on to say, we are ultimately plagued by the fact that, unlike any other creature in the universe, any other life form, we don't know who we are. Whatever it is, however we do it, we're constantly caught between being a part of and apart from. What I've come to call the human question is born here. If you can imagine 100,000 years ago or more, 200,000, whenever our species ultimately began to develop, that in-betweenness between the one and the many, that need for independence and that need for social connection, is ultimately fueled, as Erich Fromm says, by the confrontation with mortality. The experience of being human is always couched in terms of being human in a world in which everything that lives dies. And to that extent, humans are both a part of as a life form we will die, but also apart from, in that we alone know we will die. As you'll see in a subsequent lecture, we have various options. We can, after all, do as Nietzsche said, despair of death, deny death, and live in the world of mediocrity. or we can step away and step back, but we'll come more to that later. For the moment, I want to leave this question open. Everything I teach, everything I do, everything I've done since the age of 7.5 when I read the Iliad and the Odyssey comes down to this question. Let's look more closely at that question, and let's do so in terms now of Charles Darwin. Darwin provided the second piece of the puzzle. I want to make it very clear that I have a number of disagreements with Darwin, and we're going to come back ultimately to talking about Erich Fromm and how human society attempts to provide an answer to what I'm calling the human question. So, approaching this from a simple biological perspective, if such simplicity is even possible, then if we look at human beings in terms of their relationship to all other life forms, then as far as Darwin was concerned, the whole process of evolution is a process of increasing complexity. Two things happen. The first is that more complex organisms experience more autonomy of behavior because instinct has diminished. The implication of Darwin's argument is that at the same time instinct is diminishing, as organisms become intensely more complex, consciousness increases. This is not the way in which we typically think about a dog or a cat or a horse. But if you think about it in simpler terms, a cat, a dog would not, under any circumstances, remember their name or perform some of the actions that they prefer, or be able to communicate with each other or with us if there were not some form of consciousness. I want to begin by assuming that until and unless I can find empirical proof to the contrary, that what separates humans from other animals, other mammals in particular, is not the presence of consciousness itself, but rather a qualitative difference in how we are conscious. What is that qualitative difference? That qualitative difference is our awareness of mortality. I would like to add to this a difference which Darwin did not talk about. Ultimately, in the Darwinian world, I believe Darwin would argue that it is reason and logic that differentiate humans from all other life forms, and that the experience of human emotion is in some way subhuman, or relegates us to a position that's less than fully human. I think that misses the point and the reality of the situation, and I'm going to look at that now. I've told the story multiple times before, and we see it in the poetry of Edna St. Vincent Millay. But by way of review, there was a vase of roses in my office. And one day when the mother of my children visited me, she threw the roses out because they were dried, dead. But to me, every one of those roses represented a moment, a memory, when I had been with the woman I had dated for 6.5 years. And when I came back to the office to find the vase empty and the roses in the trash, I cannot begin to explain to you the emotion that I felt in that moment. It was overpowering. I went through the trash and retrieved as many as I could, but even now, the pain of those roses being gone is still very much here with me. And that brings me to the second point. As far as I can tell, only humans can embed or attach emotion to an object or to a place. This should provide us with an important key to understanding what it means to be human. And it is one that Darwin missed and one that Fromm only touches upon, unfortunately, in a less than direct way. And it comes down to this. We do not encounter the world logically and rationally. That in fact, our encounter with the world, our encounter with existence, our encounter with everything is primarily emotional. When we react to the presence of mortality, we don't do so logically and rationally. We do so emotionally. If you think about how humans are constructed biologically, we can, at least for the moment, subscribe to what I'll call the three-brain theory. We can talk about instinct. We can talk about emotion. And we can talk about logic. Logic is primarily the function of neocortex. The neocortex is a rather late development. And while we see, I unfortunately hate this word, but can't think of a better one, more primitive forms of the neocortex or more prototypical forms of the neocortex, we find them in all mammals. We find them in some other species as well. With the exception of one species of dolphin, the human neocortex is the most complex. It has 6 layers, and it is very clearly tied to logic and reason. Our instincts are a function of our reptilian brain. By the way, I refer to the neocortex as it is in us, the hominoid brain. Emotion is part of the mammalian brain. Which we share with all other mammals. This is, for lack of a better phrase, the seat of emotion. If you think about the comment I made a few minutes ago, the comment that even a cat, a dog, a horse, even the most unsophisticated mammal has some sense of emotion and at least some consciousness, then the argument can be made, and the argument that I am making is that human consciousness is not a function of the neocortex. It is the function of the mammalian brain. Before the human neocortex emerged in evolution, in the prototype of our species, however many of them there may have been, we possess some measure of consciousness and some, therefore, measure of awareness. When humans became aware of mortality, when humans became aware of the impact of death on human life, I can't tell you. But all the archaeological and anthropological evidence suggests that even Neanderthals ceremoniously buried their dead. And to have done so is to recognize the fact that to be human is ultimately to die. So part of the methodology that I use to teach, to encounter the world, to create art, takes extremely seriously the relationship between emotion, the mammalian brain, and consciousness. If we think about the implication of this, then if our first connection to the world, if our first encounter with the world is not logical and rational, then what is it? Well, the answer to that question is very simply that our first encounter with the world is emotional. And in that emotional connection to the world, our consciousness for the first time begins to think about itself, begins to think about mortality, the ambiguity, the separateness, and that this connection of human consciousness to the emotional encounter with the world is the beginning of self-awareness. I understand, or perhaps I should say, I experience how tenuous human life is. And I draw from that the conclusion, or I experience in that moment, my own mortality. In this encounter of ambiguity, in this encounter with the world that we don't understand, there is a need to make sense of it all. And I don't mean logical and rational sense, but as Carl Jung would say, as Joseph Campbell would say, this is the beginning of myth. So one of the points that I want to make very clearly particularly if you are listening to this lecture and you're in world religion, is that mythology is not true or false. Mythology is not logical and rational, for sure. But if you want to get back to the basics, to the core human experience, to the core interaction between the human and the world, then the only way to do that is through myth. In subsequent lectures, we're going to talk about Heidegger's concept that humans dwell poetically. Because that is very much tied up with the concept of myth. But for the moment, I want to make 2 points. The first is indebted to Carl Jung. Yes, there are archetypes, universal symbols, universal stories. Where Jung improperly concluded, or came to the wrong conclusion, was his argument that all humans share a kind of collective unconscious, a kind of psychic link. That's not true. Given the science of Jung's time, it is totally understandable. I think it is more likely the case, particularly in light of epigenetics, that in fact these archetypes are the product of our evolutionary neurobiology. Ultimately, in some shape or form, we're all wired the same. Which takes us to the next question. Why, if this is true, is there such a variety in human culture? And now we come back to Erich Fromm. Fromm was a Holocaust survivor who was deeply troubled by the question of violence. The tendency has always been to argue that war and violence are part of human being. Fromm, in The Anatomy of Human Destructiveness, provides an incredibly detailed look at all of the reasons why we have traditionally argued that this is the case. And as Fromm points out, to some extent, this has been a selective review of all human cultures, because there are some that do not share in that pattern of constant war. I'm going to characterize Fromm's view of human society in terms which are not used by Fromm. But ultimately, humans can be divided, or human cultures, into 3: life negative, life neutral, life affirmative. Oh, shit. A life negative culture is driven by 3 values. A life affirmative Life negative cultures are inherently violent, warlike, aggressive. And as you'll see later when we talk about Darwin, they typically have high tech. They also ultimately stress logic and reason and downplay emotion. They are inherently racist and sexist. Unfortunately, because they are incredibly aggressive, virtually all human societies that survive are life negative. When you look at the mythology of a life negative culture, you see that it embodies these values. The archetypes play out in a way that reinforces guilt, sin, conflict, destruction, war, racism, sexism. The list is endless. In a life affirmative culture, the archetypes play out very differently. We choose our own definition of what it means to be human based upon which of these cultures we fall into. A life neutral culture behaves aggressively and negatively when threatened, but tends to be affirmative within its own society. So, the final point I want to make today: the morality of a given society takes shape around the culture. It is, if you want to say, both the explicit and the implicit rules that govern a specific culture. That culture, in turn, has a definition of what it means to be human, again, implicit and explicit, which comes to it from its foundational mythology. And this is one of the primary focuses of our concern. If you're in any of the ethics classes I teach, if you're in my honors philosophy class, any change to the problems we face as a society cannot be made by passing laws. They can only be made by changing the foundational mythology. This lecture is already significantly long, so I believe I will stop here. And in the next lecture, we're going to look at Charles Darwin, Auguste Comte, and how ultimately we have chosen the paradigm of Aristotle and why that has contributed, in fact, to our being a life negative culture and to the problems that we face.